Let's be clear, you're staff, not family. My stepsister Gretchen said it with such conviction, standing in the foyer of the estate where I'd spent 30 years cooking, cleaning, and caring for the man I called father. Her brother Neil nodded, already mentally dividing up the artwork. They'd told everyone in town that I was the housekeeper who'd gotten too comfortable, that their father had kept me around out of pity after my mother died. I'm 54 years old, and I've been disappearing myself for longer than I can remember. Before we dive into this story, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, wherever you are in the world. And please hit that like button for me right now and subscribe to my channel. We're building a community of people who refuse to be silenced, who know that dignity has no expiration date. Now, back to my story. My name is Iris Whitmore. Though for most of my life, that last name felt like something I'd stolen, like a coat I was borrowing that was 3 sizes too big, sleeves hanging past my fingertips, dragging in the dirt. I wore it anyway because what else was I supposed to do? My mother, Elena, had given it to me. Elena Whitmore, the housekeeper who died when I was 24 and left me with nothing except a room in the servants' quarters and the muscle memory of how to fold fitted sheets into perfect squares. The morning everything changed, started like every other morning for the past 3 decades. I woke up at 5:30 in the small bedroom off the kitchen, the one my mother had occupied before me, the one with the single window that looked out onto the service entrance where the garbage trucks came on Tuesdays. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners. I'd offered to replace it once, years ago, and Harold had said, "Oh, Iris, don't bother with that. You should have one of the guest rooms upstairs." But we both knew I'd never take one. That's not where people like me belonged. People like me. I'd internalized that phrase so deeply it had become part of my blood chemistry. I made coffee first, the expensive kind Harold liked, the beans that cost $40 a pound and had to be ground fresh each morning. The scent filled the kitchen, rich and dark, the kind of smell that promises comfort. I used to love that smell. Now it just smelled like routine, like obligation, like the soundtrack to my own erasure. Harold was dying. We all knew it, though nobody said it out loud. At 89, his body had become a betrayal, kidneys failing, heart stuttering, lungs filling with fluid that made him cough through the nights. I'd been the one coordinating with hospice, scheduling the nurses, measuring out medications, holding the phone to his ear when Gretchen or Neil called from wherever they were living their actual lives. Lives that didn't include their father, except when they needed something. Gretchen, Neil, Harold's real children. The legitimate ones, born to Catherine Whitmore, his first wife, the society woman whose portrait still hung in the main hallway, her painted eyes following you with aristocratic disapproval. Gretchen was 59 now, living in Manhattan, married to a hedge fund manager. Her face stretched tight from procedures she swore she'd never had. Neil was 56, divorced twice, working in commercial real estate in Chicago, the kind of man who wore expensive watches and talked about deal flow at family dinners. They'd made it very clear from the moment I was old enough to understand social hierarchies that I existed in a different category. Not family, not quite staff, something in between, something less. I remember being 14, setting the table for Thanksgiving dinner. This would have been when my mother was still alive, and Gretchen, who must have been 29 then, tall and blonde and cruel in the way that beautiful people can be cruel without consequences, had picked up the place, setting I'd arranged for myself and moved it, not to another seat at the dining table, to the kitchen counter. "You'll be more comfortable here," she'd said, smiling that smile that wasn't really a smile. "Closer to everything. You know, in case we need anything." My mother had caught my eye from across the room, and the look she'd given me was pure instruction. Don't fight, don't argue, don't make waves. So I'd eaten my turkey on a bar stool in the kitchen while their laughter echoed from the dining room, and I'd learned the most important lesson of my life. Your place is where people tell you your place is, and if you accept it long enough, it becomes true. Harold had been at that dinner. He'd said nothing, done nothing, just passed the cranberry sauce to his daughter and asked his son about law school, and I'd told myself he probably didn't even notice. That's what I'd been telling myself for 30 years. He didn't notice. He didn't see. He didn't know how they treated me, but he did. He must have. How could he not? The morning he died, 3 weeks before the will reading that would detonate my entire existence, I'd been the one sitting beside his bed, not Gretchen, not Neil. They were on their way, which was code for, we'll get there when we get there, no need to rush for something as mundane as death. I'd held his hand, the skin papery and spotted, his fingers cold despite the blankets I'd piled on top of him. "Iris," he'd whispered, his voice like wind through dry leaves. "I need to tell you something." My heart had jumped. 30 years of proximity, of quiet dinners where he'd taught me about Hemingway and Fitzgerald, where he'd asked about the online literature courses I'd been taking at community college, where he'd looked at me with something that felt almost like pride. 30 years, and I'd never let myself hope that it meant anything beyond kindness, beyond charity toward the orphaned housekeeper's daughter. "You don't have to say anything," I'd told him, squeezing his hand gently. "Just rest." "You don't understand," he'd said, more urgent now, trying to sit up, his breath rattling. "I should have. I needed to." And then the hospice nurse had come in, and the moment had passed, and by the next morning, Harold Whitmore was gone, and whatever he'd needed to tell me had gone with him into whatever darkness waited on the other side. I'd cried. Of course I'd cried, not just for him, but for myself, for the loss of the only person in 30 years who'd treated me like I mattered, even if I'd just been the charity case. Even if I'd just been the orphan he'd kept around out of guilt or pity or whatever wealthy people feel when they do small kindnesses. It had been something, and now it was nothing. The funeral was a Wednesday. Gray skies, rain threatening but never quite arriving, just hanging there in the air like grief that won't fully land. I'd arranged everything, of course. The flowers, the catering, the sound system for the church service. I'd picked out Harold's suit, the navy one he'd always said made him look distinguished. I'd written the obituary that ran in the Times, carefully listing his accomplishments, his charity work, his surviving children, Gretchen and Neil. I hadn't listed myself. Why would I? The service was full of people I'd seen at Christmas parties and summer garden events over the years. People who'd smiled at me while handing me their empty champagne glasses. People who'd complimented the canapes without ever thinking about who'd made them. I'd stood in the back of the church in a black dress I'd bought at Target, watching Gretchen sob dramatically in the front pew, while Neil rubbed her back with the performative grief of someone who'd learned to fake emotions at some expensive boarding school. After the service, everyone came back to the estate. Of course they did. The Whitmore estate was the kind of place people wanted to be, even, especially, for a funeral. 12 acres in Connecticut, the main house built in 1887, updated but never modernized, all original crown molding and crystal chandeliers and windows that looked out over gardens that required 3 full-time groundskeepers. I'd lived here my entire life. Every memory I had was trapped in these walls. My mother teaching me to arrange flowers in the conservatory, Harold reading to me in his study when I was 11 and recovering from pneumonia, teenage birthday parties I'd never been invited to, watching from the kitchen as Gretchen's friends splashed in the pool. First kisses I'd never had because how do you date when you're the housekeeper's daughter, when everyone knows you're not quite good enough, when leaving the estate feels like abandoning the only safety you've ever known? This house was my prison and my sanctuary, and I'd never once questioned whether I deserved either. The reception after the funeral was when everything started to crack. I was in the kitchen, where else would I be, arranging sandwiches on silver platters, when I heard Gretchen's voice in the hallway, talking to someone I couldn't see. "We're going to need to figure out what to do with Iris," she was saying, her tone brisk and businesslike, the way you'd discuss what to do with old furniture. "Obviously, she can't stay here." My hands froze on a tray of smoked salmon. "I thought she worked here," a man's voice responded. Someone I didn't recognize. Well, technically yes, but it's been more of a compassionate arrangement. My father felt sorry for her after her mother died, but now that he's gone, there's really no reason to keep her on. We'll give her 30 days. Maybe a small severance. She's been here forever, so we should probably be generous. Generous? The word hit me like a slap. The poor thing probably doesn't have anywhere else to go, Gretchen continued, and I could hear the pity in her voice. The kind of pity that's really just contempt wearing a mask. But we can't run a charity. Neil and I have been discussing it, and we think the estate would be better utilized if we converted some of the staff quarters into a gym. Modern wellness space, you know. We'll need to bring in designers. This whole place needs updating. I stood there in the kitchen that smelled like my childhood, holding a platter of food I'd prepared for people who were already planning to erase me, and I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart, something deeper, some foundational belief that if you were good enough, quiet enough, useful enough, people would let you exist. I carried the sandwiches out to the dining room anyway, because that's what I did. That's who I was. Gretchen saw me and smiled. The smile of someone who doesn't realize the help is ears. Oh, Iris, those look wonderful. You've always had such a gift for this sort of thing. It's going to be hard to replace you. I wanted to say something, anything, to tell her I'd heard every word, to tell her this was my home, the only home I'd ever known, to tell her that 30 years of service should count for something, that I'd earned the right to exist in this space through sheer force of presence. Instead, I said, "Thank you, Miss Gretchen. Is there anything else you need?" She waved me away, already turning back to her conversation, and I retreated to the kitchen like the good invisible servant I'd been trained to be. Neil found me there an hour later, his tie loosened, a drink in his hand that definitely wasn't his first. He leaned against the counter with the casual posture of someone who'd never had to question his right to take up space. "Hey, Iris. Hell of a day, huh?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Listen, Gretchen and I have been talking, and we want you to know we appreciate everything you've done for Dad over the years. Really, you've been very dedicated." There was a pause, heavy with implication. "We're going to be making some changes around here," he continued, studying the ice in his glass like it contained answers. "Nothing personal. Just, you know, the estate is going to need some work, and we'll be bringing in new people, and it might be easier for everyone if I leave." I finished for him, my voice flat. He looked relieved that I'd said it so he didn't have to. "Yeah, we'll work something out. Money, references, whatever you need. You've been here so long, we know you'll need time to figure things out." 30 days. That's what Gretchen had said. 30 days to pack up a lifetime and disappear into a world I'd never been part of. "The will reading is next week," Neil added, finishing his drink. "Wednesday at 2. Mr. Ashford will be here. Just family, obviously, but you should probably be available in case we need anything." Just family, obviously. I watched him walk away, back to the world of people who mattered, people who inherited things, people whose existence was never questioned. And I thought about how precisely I'd been categorized. Not family, not quite staff, just available, just there, just Iris, who'd always been so good at making herself useful. That night, after everyone had left and the house was finally quiet, I walked through the empty rooms with a bottle of Harold's wine, the good stuff, the kind I'd never presumed to drink before. I walked past the portrait of Catherine Whitmore, past the library where Harold had taught me to love Steinbeck, past the conservatory where my mother had shown me how to arrange white roses so they looked like they were floating. I ended up in Harold's study, the wine stain on the marble floor still faintly visible despite my scrubbing. His desk was exactly as he'd left it, papers stacked neatly, reading glasses folded on top of an unfinished book, the smell of his cologne still lingering faintly in the air. I sat in his leather chair, the one I'd never sat in before because it wasn't my place, and I let myself imagine, just for a moment, what it would have been like if things had been different. If my mother had been his wife instead of his housekeeper, if I'd been Gretchen, inheriting everything without question, if I'd never learned to make myself small. But that wasn't my life. My life was 30 days to pack, a small severance, and the rest of my existence trying to figure out who Iris Whitmore was when she wasn't defined by the walls she'd spent 54 years serving. I poured myself another glass of wine and watched the moonlight cut patterns across the floor, and I wondered if this was how ghosts felt. Present, but invisible. There, but not acknowledged. Existing in spaces they no longer had permission to occupy. The will reading was scheduled for the following Wednesday at 2 o'clock. Mr. Ashford, Harold's attorney for 40 years, would arrive with his leather briefcase and his careful lawyer's face, and he would read out the distribution of Harold's estate in that formal language that makes even generosity sound like a transaction. I assumed I'd be mentioned. Maybe. A small bequest. To Iris, who served my household faithfully, I leave $25,000 and my thanks. Something like that. Enough to make Gretchen and Neil feel magnanimous, not enough to actually change my circumstances. I'd started packing anyway. Not because I wanted to, but because denial only works if you have power, and I'd never had any. I'd boxed up my mother's things first, the photos, her jewelry box with the broken clasp, the recipe cards written in her careful handwriting, then my own belongings, which fit into surprisingly few boxes. Books, mostly. Clothes. A life that could be condensed into 6 cardboard containers and forgotten. The guest room I'd been using, not the servants' quarters anymore. Harold had insisted I take a proper bedroom after my mother died, and I'd chosen the smallest one, the one furthest from the main rooms, because even generosity felt like trespassing, looked stripped and impersonal by the time Wednesday arrived, like a hotel room after checkout, like I'd never been there at all. I dressed carefully that morning. Black pants, a cream blouse, low heels. The uniform of someone who doesn't want to be noticed but needs to appear respectful. I'd learned this costume decades ago. I pulled my hair back into a low bun and checked myself in the mirror, and the woman looking back at me was exactly what Gretchen and Neil had always seen. Forgettable, serviceable, there, but not really there. Mr. Ashford arrived at 1:30, early as always. His silver hair perfectly combed, his suit expensive but understated. I let him in through the front door, because who else would answer it? And he gave me a look I couldn't quite read. Something between sympathy and knowledge. Something that made my stomach tighten with unnamed anxiety. "Miss Whitmore," he said, using my last name the way he always had, formal and respectful, in a way that had always felt unearned. "How are you holding up?" "Fine, thank you," I lied, because what else do you say? The truth is too big for casual conversation. "Is there somewhere private we could speak before Gretchen and Neil arrive?" he asked, and the request surprised me. "Just for a few minutes. It's important." We went to Harold's study. His study, I reminded myself. Not mine, never mine, and Mr. Boyardee. Ashford closed the door behind us with the deliberate care of someone about to deliver news that required closed doors. "Iris, I need to prepare you for what's about to happen in this room today," he began, setting his briefcase on the desk but not opening it yet. Harold left very specific instructions about how this will reading should proceed, and there are elements that are going to be surprising to everyone, but especially to you. My heart was beating too fast. "I don't understand." "You will," he said gently. "Soon. But I needed to tell you first, privately, that you should sit down when Gretchen and Neil arrive. Not in the corner, not standing by, ready to serve. Sit at the table, as a participant." "I'm not family," I said automatically, the script I'd been given decades ago. "Mr. Baus." Ashford looked at me with something that might have been sadness. "Iris, do you remember about 6 years ago Harold asked you to come with him to a medical appointment? Said he needed some routine blood work and would appreciate the company?" I did remember. It had been strange at the time. Harold usually went to doctors alone or with his usual driver, but I'd gone because he'd asked. We'd sat in a sterile office while a nurse drew my blood alongside his, and I'd assumed it was some kind of comparative screening. Maybe they thought genetic conditions could be compared. I hadn't questioned it. That's what I'd been trained not to do. Question. That wasn't routine blood work, Mr. Ashford said quietly. That was a DNA test. Court admissible, doctor supervised, documented in Harold's medical records. And later that same year, you signed some paperwork that Harold told you were medical release forms. Do you remember that? I felt cold. Yes. Those weren't medical release forms, Iris. Those were adoption papers. Legal adult adoption papers. Harold had been your legal father since 1998. You've been Iris Whitmore not because of your mother's marriage, but because of a legal adoption that made you Harold's daughter in every way that matters under the law. The room tilted. The marble floor, the mahogany desk, the portrait of Catherine Whitmore on the wall. Everything seemed to slide sideways, and I gripped the arm of the chair I wasn't sitting in yet, because my legs had forgotten how to hold weight. That's not possible, I whispered. My mother was Harold's daughter's age when she came to work here, Mr. Ashford continued, his voice steady and careful, like he was dismantling a bomb. But before she was hired, before Catherine Whitmore was even in the picture, Harold and Elena had a brief relationship, a very brief relationship that resulted in a pregnancy. Elena found out she was pregnant around the same time Harold got engaged to Catherine, a marriage his family had arranged, money marrying money, the way these things worked back then. Elena made a choice. She kept the pregnancy secret. She took the job as housekeeper years later, when you were already 10, because she and Harold had stayed in touch, and he wanted to be able to see you, to know you, to be in your life even if he couldn't claim you publicly. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room had turned solid. This can't be real, I said. But even as I said it, pieces were clicking into place. Harold's attention, the way he'd taught me, encouraged me, looked at me with something more than employer's kindness. The routine medical appointment, the paperwork I'd signed without reading because I trusted him. The way he'd said my name, Iris, like it meant something. It's all documented, Mr. Ashford said gently. Medical records, legal records, letters. Harold wrote extensively about you, about his regret at not telling you the truth, about his reasons for keeping the secret. He was trying to protect everyone, you, Elena, Catherine, Gretchen, and Neil, but protection became prison for all of you. There was a knock at the door. Gretchen's voice, impatient. Are we starting, or what? Neil and I have flights to catch. Mr. Ashford looked at me. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Iris? I understood nothing, everything. The entire architecture of my life had just been revealed as a stage set, flimsy and false, and I was standing in the wreckage trying to remember which parts of me were real. I'm his daughter, I said, testing the words, and they felt like a language I didn't speak. You've always been his daughter, Mr. Ashford corrected. You just didn't know it. He opened the door. Gretchen walked in first, power suit, heels clicking on marble, already talking on her phone. Neil followed, looking bored, checking his watch. They sat down at the conference table in the study without even glancing at me, and I realized they expected me to stand against the wall, to wait for instructions, to be available but invisible. Instead, I sat down, in a chair, at the table. Gretchen glanced up, annoyed. Iris, this is family business. We'll let you know if we need anything. Miss Whitmore will be staying, Mr. Ashford said firmly, and there was steel in his voice I'd never heard before. She's a direct participant in this will reading. Neil laughed. Actually laughed. What? Did Dad leave her the silverware or something? That's sweet. But please, Mr. Ashford interrupted, sitting down and opening his briefcase with the decisive click of latches releasing. Let's begin. Before we discuss the distribution of assets, there's something you need to understand about the structure of Harold's family. And that's when my life ended and began, in the same breath, in the same moment. That's when I learned that the woman I'd been for 54 years had been a fiction, and the truth was about to rewrite everything. The truth was about to walk into that room. And nobody, especially not me, was ready for it. Mr. Ashford opened the folder on the table, and I watched Gretchen's perfectly manicured fingers drum against the mahogany surface with the impatience of someone who'd already mentally spent her inheritance. "Before we discuss the distribution of Harold's estate," Mr. Ashford began, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of legal precision, "there's something you need to understand about the structure of Harold's family." Neil shifted in his seat. "What's there to understand? It's Gretchen and me. That's the family." Mr. Ashford looked at him with the patient expression of someone about to shatter reality. "That's where you're incorrect." He slid a document across the table. "DNA results," the header read. My vision blurred, trying to focus on the words, on the numbers, on the percentage that apparently defined biology, 99.97% probability of paternity. "Iris is not Elena Whitmore's daughter," Mr. Ashford said, and the room went so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "She's Harold Whitmore's daughter." For 3 seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, and I thought absurdly that time shouldn't be allowed to continue, when reality had just stopped making sense. Then Gretchen laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound, like glass breaking. "That's insane. That's absolutely insane. She's the housekeeper's kid. Everyone knows that. Elena and Harold had a brief relationship before Harold's engagement to your mother," Mr. Ashford continued, unmoved by her reaction. "Elena discovered she was pregnant around the same time Harold became engaged to Catherine Whitmore. It was a marriage arranged by their families. You know how these things worked in that social circle. Elena made the decision to keep the pregnancy secret, to protect Harold, to protect his future, to protect everyone." I felt like I was drowning in air. My mother had known, had looked at me every single day of my life and never said the words. "He's your father. The man teaching you to read Shakespeare is your father. The man who remembers your birthday is your father. The man whose children treat you like garbage is your father. And they're your siblings, and you belong here. You've always belonged here." "This is a con," Neil said, his face flushing red. "This is fraud. She manipulated him. The DNA test was conducted 6 years ago," Mr. Ashford interrupted, sliding another document across the table. "Doctor supervised, court admissible, with samples taken from both Harold and Iris. The results were witnessed and notarized. Iris had no idea what the test was for. Harold told her it was routine medical screening. I remembered that day with sudden painful clarity. Harold had seemed nervous in the car, had held my hand in the waiting room, had looked at me after the blood draw with something in his eyes I'd mistaken for kindness but was actually recognition. Confirmation, the scientific proof of what he'd always known, but never had the courage to say." Gretchen's hands were shaking now, her perfect composure fracturing. Even if that's true, it doesn't mean anything. She wasn't raised as family. She wasn't. "Harold legally adopted Iris in 1998, Mr. Ashford said, producing yet another document. Adult adoption papers properly filed and processed. She signed them thinking they were medical release forms. Harold's deception, not hers. She became his legal daughter 27 years ago. She's been Iris Whitmore, daughter of Harold Whitmore, for over half her life. She just didn't know it." The room was spinning. I gripped the edge of the table, and for the first time in 30 years, nobody told me to stop touching the furniture. "This is why I'm here," I heard myself say, my voice coming from somewhere outside my body. "Not to serve, to inherit." Mr. Ashford's expression softened. "Yes, Iris, you're here as Harold's daughter, his only legally recognized child at the time of his death, since the adoption superseded any previous family structure." "Wait," Gretchen said, standing up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "What do you mean, only legally recognized? We're his biological children." "From his first marriage," Mr. Ashford said calmly, "which ended in divorce in 1985, as you know. The adoption of Iris occurred in 1998, 13 years after that divorce. Under Connecticut estate law, adopted children have the same inheritance rights as biological children. but Harold's will is very specific about his wishes regardless. He opened another folder, this one thicker, and I saw my name on the first page, Last Will and Testament of Harold James Whitmore. Below it, in Harold's shaky handwriting, for my daughter Iris, who deserved better than my silence. My eyes filled with tears I'd been holding back for 54 years. The estate, Mr. Ashford read, his voice steady and professional, including the Connecticut property consisting of the main house and all 12 acres, the investment portfolio currently valued at $24 million, the art collection, the vintage automobile collection, and all personal property not otherwise specified, I leave to my daughter, Iris Elena Whitmore. The words landed like bombs. $24 million. The house. Everything. The life Gretchen and Neil had been counting on, dividing up, already spending, gone, transferred, given to the woman they'd spent 3 decades treating like she was lucky to sleep in the servants' quarters. To my children, Gretchen and Neil, Mr. Ashford continued, I leave $100,000 each. Neil's face had gone from red to purple. 100,000. 100,000. The estate is worth over 30 million, and you're giving us what your father specified in his will, Mr. Ashford finished, which is far more than legally required, given that adult children have no automatic inheritance rights in Connecticut. Gretchen lunged forward, slamming her hands on the table. She manipulated him. She isolated him. She made him think. She believed she was the housekeeper's daughter, Mr. Ashford said, his voice sharp now, cutting through her rage. Every interaction, every kindness, every moment of care she provided was done under the assumption that she was exactly what you told her she was. Charity, staff, someone who should be grateful for a room and modest pay. Harold documented this extensively. He pulled out a stack of letters, and I recognized Harold's handwriting immediately. Those hours he'd spent in his study doing correspondence. He'd been writing about me, to me, letters he'd never sent because he was too afraid, too guilty, too trapped by his own choices. I'll read you portions, Mr. Ashford said, putting on his reading glasses. From a letter dated March 2019. Today, Iris apologized for sitting in the living room. Apologized. In the house where she's lived her entire life, in the home that is rightfully hers, she apologized for occupying space. Gretchen had made a comment about the help getting too comfortable, and Iris immediately retreated to her room. I said nothing. Again, I said nothing. I am a coward of the highest order. My chest felt like it was caving in. He'd seen it. He'd seen everything and done nothing. From October 2020, Mr. Ashford continued, Neil asked Iris to prepare his rental car return during his visit. Not asked, told. Ordered her to handle his personal errands as though she existed to serve him. She did it without question. She has been so thoroughly trained to diminish herself that she doesn't even recognize the cruelty anymore. This is my fault. I could have stopped this decades ago. I could have told her the truth. Instead, I let my children treat their sister like a servant because I was too weak to face the consequences of my own deception. Stop, Gretchen said, her voice breaking. Stop reading those. From January of this year, Mr. Ashford pressed on, relentless now. I'm dying and I still haven't told her. What kind of father does this? What kind of man lets his daughter spend 54 years believing she's worthless? Gretchen asked me yesterday when Iris would be cleared out after my death. Cleared out. Like furniture. Like garbage. And Iris overheard. I saw her face in the doorway, and she didn't defend herself. She just went back to the kitchen and made dinner. She made us dinner after hearing herself discuss like something to be disposed of. I am leaving everything to Iris, not because I'm trying to punish Gretchen and Neil, but because she's the only one who stayed, the only one who cared, the only one who deserves to finally know that she was never beneath anyone. She was always mine. I was crying openly now, and I didn't care. 30 years of swallowed feelings, of making myself small, of accepting every cruel word and dismissive gesture, It was all pouring out of me, and somewhere in that flood was rage. Pure, clean, righteous rage. "This is fraud," Neil repeated, but his voice was weaker now, desperate. "We'll contest this. We'll sue. You'll lose," Mr. Ashford said flatly. "Harold prepared for this contingency. He knew you'd fight. There are medical evaluations from 3 separate psychiatrists conducted in the last year of his life, all confirming his mental competence. There are video recordings of him discussing his wishes. There are witnesses, his doctor, his accountant, his oldest friend Martin Chambers, all prepared to testify that Harold was of sound mind and clear intent. He wanted Iris to have what she's always deserved: a home, security, recognition." He pulled out a laptop from his briefcase and turned it toward us. "He recorded this message 3 months before his death. He wanted you all to see it." The screen flickered to life, and there was Harold, thinner than I remembered, his skin papery and pale, but his eyes were clear, alert, determined. "If you're watching this," Harold's recorded voice said, and I felt my heart break all over again, "it means I didn't have the courage to tell Iris the truth while I was alive. That cowardice is my greatest sin." On screen, Harold took a shaky breath. "Iris, my dear girl, you are my daughter. You have always been my daughter. Not because I signed papers or because DNA proves biology, but because you are brave where I was cowardly. You are kind where I was weak. You gave me 30 years of grace I didn't deserve. You cared for me when my biological children couldn't be bothered to visit unless they needed money. You read to me when my eyes got bad. You held my hand when I was afraid. You were the daughter who showed up, and I repaid you by letting you believe you were worthless." Gretchen had gone very still. Neil was staring at the screen like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. "The money I'm leaving you," Harold continued, looking directly into the camera, directly at me, "is the least of what you deserve. You deserve to have been claimed. You deserve to have sat at every holiday dinner as family, not staff. You deserve to have grown up knowing your father loved you. I failed you in every way that mattered, but I will not fail you in this. The house is yours. The security is yours. The life you should have had from the beginning. It's yours now. Take it, own it. And please, please forgive me for not being brave enough to give it to you while I could see your face when you learned the truth." He paused, wiping his eyes. "To Gretchen and Neil, you have spent your adult lives treating your sister like she was beneath you. You told her she didn't belong. You made her apologize for existing. You were handed every advantage: education, money, social status, my public acknowledgement, and you used those advantages to be cruel. The $100,000 each is more than you've earned through your sporadic visits and constant demands for money. Take it and understand. I was a weak father to all 3 of you, but at least Iris stayed. At least she cared. At least she tried." The video ended. The screen went dark. And in the silence that followed, I felt something shift inside me. Something that had been broken for so long, I'd forgotten it was supposed to be whole. "That's it," Mr. Ashford said, closing the laptop. "The will is ironclad. The evidence is overwhelming. Harold wanted Iris to inherit, and Harold's wishes will be honored. You have no legal recourse that will succeed." "We'll see about that," Gretchen hissed, grabbing her purse. "My lawyers will tell you exactly what I'm telling you," Mr. Ashford interrupted. "This will is airtight. Fight it if you must, but you'll spend your $100,000 on legal fees and still lose. Your father knew you'd react this way. He prepared accordingly." Neil was staring at me now, really looking at me for maybe the first time in 30 years. "You knew," he said. "You had to have known. Nobody's that good an actress." And that's when something inside me snapped. Not broke, snapped into place. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "I didn't know, because you were so good at convincing me I was nothing that I believed you. Every time you called me the help, every time you moved my place setting to the kitchen, every time you laughed when I walked into a room or sighed like I was an inconvenience, I believed you. I internalized it so deeply that even when a man who could have been something to me looked at me with affection, I assumed it was pity, because that's what you taught me to expect. I stood up, and for the first time in my life, I was taller than Gretchen, not physically, but in every way that mattered. You spent 30 years making sure I knew my place, I continued, my voice steady even as my hands shook, but my place was here all along, not as staff, not as charity, as the daughter, as family, as someone who deserved to sit at the table instead of serving it. Gretchen's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. You don't deserve this. You don't deserve any of this. You're right, I said quietly. I deserve more. I deserved a father who claimed me, siblings who treated me with basic human dignity, a childhood where I didn't have to earn my right to exist. But we don't always get what we deserve, do we? Sometimes we get what's written in a will. Neil moved toward me, and I saw Mr. Ashford tense, ready to intervene. But Neil stopped a few feet away, his expression twisted into something ugly. You made him think you were just the maid. You lied by omission. I was just the maid, I interrupted, because that's what everyone told me I was. I didn't lie. I didn't manipulate. I didn't know. And the fact that you can't comprehend someone being genuinely unaware of their own value says more about you than it does about me. The silence that followed was heavy with 30 years of unspoken truths finally spoken. I want you both to leave, I said, and the words felt foreign in my mouth. I'd never told anyone to leave this house. I'd never had that authority. This is my home now. It's been my home my entire life, but now it's legally, officially mine. And you're not welcome here. You can't, Gretchen started. She can, Mr. Ashford confirmed. As of today, Iris is the sole owner of this property. She has every legal right to ask you to leave. I walked to the study door and opened it. The hallway stretched before me. The same hallway I'd walked down thousands of times carrying trays, carrying laundry, carrying the weight of my own invisibility. But I wasn't invisible anymore. Get out, I said. And here's what I learned in that moment. Power doesn't roar. It doesn't need to. Power is quiet. Power is standing in a doorway of your own house and knowing that you don't have to justify your existence anymore, that you don't have to make yourself small to make other people comfortable, that you can take up space because the space was always yours. Gretchen grabbed her coat, her movements sharp and angry. This isn't over. We'll fight this. You'll lose, I said simply, but go ahead and try. Spend your 100,000 on lawyers. Spend the next year in depositions and court hearings. At the end of it all, I'll still be here, in my father's house, and you'll still be exactly what you've always been. People who confused wealth with worth. Neil followed his sister to the door, and at the last moment he turned back. He was our father first. And I was his daughter longest, I replied. 30 years I was here, Neil. Where were you? They left without answering, because there was no answer. The front door slammed, and through the window I watched their rental car disappear down the long driveway, past the gardens my mother had tended, past the oak trees Harold had shown me how to climb when I was 8, past the gate that separated this estate from the rest of the world. When the sound of their car faded, I turned back to Mr. Ashford, who was watching me with something that looked like pride. There's more, he said gently. Letters. Harold left you years of letters. They're in his safe. He wanted you to read them when you were ready. I don't know if I'm ready, I admitted. Nobody ever is, he said. But he loved you, Iris. In his flawed, complicated, cowardly way, he loved you. And he spent the last years of his life trying to document that love because he couldn't speak it out loud. After Mr. Ashford left, after the legal documents were signed and witnessed and filed, after the reality of $24 million and a 12-acre estate settled over me like a weight I didn't know how to carry, I sat alone in Harold's study and I cried. I cried for the little girl who'd eaten Thanksgiving dinner on a kitchen bar stool. I cried for the teenager who'd believed she was lucky to have a room in this house. I cried for the woman who'd spent 3 decades apologizing for existing. I cried for my mother, who'd kept a secret that must have eaten her alive every single day. And I cried for Harold, the father who'd loved me enough to give me everything except the one thing I'd needed most, acknowledgement. But underneath the grief, something else was growing, something sharp and clear and absolutely unbreakable. Anger, not the hot, explosive kind, the cold, calculated kind, the kind that knows exactly what it's worth and refuses to accept less, ever again. Gretchen and Neil thought this was over. They thought they could contest the will and intimidate me back into submission. They thought 30 years of conditioning would make me fold. They didn't know who I was. They'd never known, because I hadn't known either. But I was learning. I opened Harold's safe. The combination was my birthday, of course it was, and inside were dozens of letters, organized by year, each one addressed to "My dear Iris," in his careful handwriting. I started reading, and with each page the architecture of my life rearranged itself. Harold describing how my mother had been his first real love before duty and family expectations had forced him to marry Catherine. Harold explaining how he'd watched me grow up from a distance, wanting to claim me but terrified of the scandal, of what it would do to his reputation, to his marriage, to his legitimate children. Harold detailing every moment he'd almost told me the truth, my high school graduation, my 21st birthday, the day my mother died, and how he'd convinced himself each time that silence was protection. "I thought I was protecting you from shame," he wrote in a letter dated 2015. "But I was really protecting myself from accountability. You lived with the shame anyway. You lived as the illegitimate daughter, the charity case, the help, when you should have lived as what you were, mine." There were letters apologizing for every Christmas dinner where I'd served instead of sitting, letters apologizing for every time Gretchen had been cruel, and he'd said nothing, letters apologizing for not being braver, stronger, better. And then I found the letter that changed everything, the one dated just 2 months before he died. "Iris," it began, "if you're reading this, you know the truth now. You know you're my daughter. You know you were always supposed to inherit everything, and you're probably wondering why I did this. Why I gave you money but not acknowledgement. Why I gave you security but not identity. Let me tell you, because I'm a coward, yes, but also because I wanted you to have power. Gretchen and Neil have never had to fight for anything. They've never had to prove themselves. They've never had to be strategic or strong or resourceful because they were handed everything from birth. You, my dear girl, have had to survive. You've had to be smarter, kinder, more resilient than anyone should have to be, and now you have resources to match that strength. They will fight you. They will try to take what's yours. They will use every weapon they have, lawyers, social pressure, public opinion, and you will win. Not because of the will or the DNA test or the adoption papers, though those are ironclad. You'll win because you've been fighting your whole life, and they've never had to learn how. Use what I've given you, not just the money, but the lesson. The people who tried to make you small were wrong. You were never small. You were just preparing to be enormous. I read that letter 3 times, and by the 3rd reading something had crystallized inside me. They wanted a fight? I'd give them a fight, but not the one they were expecting. Because here's what Gretchen and Neil didn't understand. I'd spent 30 years watching them, learning them, understanding exactly what made them tick, what scared them, what they wanted. I'd been invisible for so long I'd become the perfect observer, and now I had the resources to use everything I'd learned. They thought this was about money, about inheritance, about who deserved what. But it wasn't. It had never been. It was about recognition, about belonging, about a lifetime of being told you're nothing, and finally having the power to prove everyone wrong. I sat in my father's chair, my chair now, and I looked around at the house that had been my prison and my sanctuary, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to just survive their attacks. I wasn't going to just defend what was mine. I was going to make sure that everyone who'd ever made me feel small understood exactly how wrong they'd been, and I was going to do it in a way they'd never see coming, because that's what happens when you underestimate the maid. You forget she's been watching, listening, learning, waiting, and now she owns everything. The question isn't whether I'll win. The will is ironclad, the evidence overwhelming. The outcome certain. Stay with me, because the legal battle is just beginning, and Gretchen and Neil are about to learn that the quiet ones are quiet for a reason. We're watching, we're learning, we're remembering, and when we finally speak, the world listens. But here's the question that kept me awake that first night after the will reading, sitting in my father's study with $24 million attached to my name and 30 years of conditioning telling me I didn't deserve to be in that chair. What do you do when winning feels exactly like losing? Because I'd won. Legally, financially, irrevocably, I'd won. The house was mine. The money was mine. The validation I'd craved my entire life had arrived in the form of legal documents and a dead man's confession. But Gretchen and Neil were out there, furious and wounded. Already calling lawyers. Harold's video had played on a loop in my mind all night. I failed you in every way that mattered, and my mother had looked at me every single day and kept the secret that could have changed everything. I had everything, and I felt completely empty. The legal battle that Gretchen and Neil promised came exactly as Mr. Ashford predicted: swift, expensive, and utterly futile. They filed a contest within 48 hours, claiming undue influence, mental incompetence, fraud. Their lawyers were the expensive kind, the kind with corner offices and marble lobbies, the kind who billed $500 an hour to tell wealthy people what they wanted to hear. It took exactly 3 months for reality to hit them, 3 months of depositions where Harold's doctors testified to his mental clarity, 3 months of witnesses, his accountant, his oldest friend Martin, even the hospice nurses, all confirming the same thing. Harold knew exactly what he was doing. He'd been planning this for years, and Iris had no idea. The judge dismissed their contest in a hearing that lasted 20 minutes. I wasn't even required to attend, though I did, sitting in the back of the courtroom in a navy dress that had cost more than my entire previous wardrobe. Watching Gretchen's face crumble when the judge said, "Petition denied," was supposed to feel like victory. It just felt like watching someone else lose what I'd lost decades ago, the fantasy of being wanted. They burned through their 100,000 each on legal fees, just as Mr. Ashford had warned, and when their lawyer gently suggested they accept the outcome, Neil had apparently thrown a glass paperweight at his office wall. I know this because the legal assistant who witnessed it told the story at a charity event I attended 6 months later, not knowing I was standing right there, not recognizing the former housekeeper now wearing Alexander McQueen. I could have been angry about that, about being gossip, about my family's dysfunction becoming entertainment for Connecticut's social elite. Instead, I bought a table at the next charity gala and donated $50,000 in Harold's name. Let them talk. Let them whisper. I was done trying to be invisible. But revenge, I was learning, isn't actually what heals you. It's not even particularly satisfying. What heals you is becoming so completely yourself that the opinions of people who hurt you stop mattering entirely. The estate transformed slowly, deliberately. I didn't sell it. That's what Gretchen had been hoping I'd do, turn it into cash and leave, prove I was really just the housekeeper's daughter playing dress-up in a dead man's house. Instead, I made it mine. Harold's study became a library, but not the stuffy kind with leather furniture that nobody sits in. I opened it to the community every Saturday afternoon. Free, no appointments necessary. Just come in, read, exist in a space that said, "You belonged." I hired a young librarian named Maya who'd grown up in foster care and understood what it meant to never quite feel at home anywhere. The gardens my mother had tended became a memorial to her. Elena's garden, the sign read. I planted her favorite roses, white ones that looked like they were floating. and I finally let myself grieve her. Not just her death, but her choices. The secret she'd kept that had shaped my entire existence. I was angry at her. I was grateful to her. I was heartbroken for her. All of it at once, the way love actually works when you stop trying to make it simple. I hired staff, but I paid them triple the market rate and treated them like human beings with boundaries and lives outside my house. Maria, the new housekeeper, laughed the first time I asked her to sit down and have coffee with me. "Miss Whitmore, it's not how this works," she'd said. And I'd replied, "It is now. Call me Iris, and tell me about your daughter's college applications." We became friends, real friends, because power isn't about making people serve you. It's about recognizing that service shouldn't require someone to diminish themselves. I went back to school, officially this time, not just online courses taken in stolen hours, enrolled in a master's program in social work, sat in classrooms with people half my age and learned the academic language for what I'd lived: systemic marginalization, internalized oppression, trauma responses. My thesis was on invisible labor in domestic spaces. My advisor said it was the most emotionally raw academic writing she'd ever read. I took that as a compliment. And slowly, so slowly I barely noticed it happening, I stopped waiting for permission to exist. The encounter with Gretchen happened 9 months after the will reading, completely by accident, in the most mundane possible setting, the produce section of Whole Foods. I was examining avocados, because that's what you do when you have money and time, and you're trying to figure out who you are beyond survival. And I looked up, and there she was. She'd lost weight. Her hair was different, shorter, less severe. She looked tired in a way that expensive skincare couldn't hide. For a moment, we just stared at each other across a display of organic kale, two women who'd lived in the same house for decades, but had never actually known each other. I waited for the anger to come, the satisfaction, the urge to say something cutting, to remind her that I'd won and she'd lost, and karma was real after all. But what came instead was something quieter, something sadder. "Gretchen," I said, and my voice was steady, calm, the voice of someone who didn't need anything from her anymore. She looked like she might run or cry, or both. Instead, she gripped her shopping cart and said, "I heard you opened the library at the house." "I did. People say it's nice, that you're doing good things." I nodded, waited. I'd spent a lifetime filling uncomfortable silences for other people. I didn't do that anymore. "I didn't know," Gretchen said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "about you being his daughter. I really didn't know." "I believe you," I said. And I did, because the cruelty had been genuine. You can't fake that level of contempt. She'd really believed I was beneath her. "But you knew I was human. You knew I had feelings. You knew every time you called me the help, or moved my place setting, or sighed when I walked into a room. You knew it hurt, and you did it anyway." She flinched. "I was raised to believe that some people matter more than others," I finished. "I know. I was raised to believe I was one of the people who mattered less. We were both wrong. I'm sorry," she said, and I could see she meant it. But sorry doesn't erase 30 years. Sorry doesn't give you back the childhood you should have had, or the father who should have claimed you, or the sense of belonging that should have been your birthright. "I appreciate that," I said. "But here's what I need you to understand. I didn't take anything from you. I didn't manipulate Harold. I didn't scheme or plot or seduce a lonely old man. I was his daughter, and he finally did right by me, not to hurt you, to acknowledge me." "He gave you everything," Gretchen said, and there was still pain in her voice, still loss. "He gave me money," I corrected. "What I needed was a father who claimed me at Thanksgiving dinner, who introduced me as his daughter instead of letting you treat me like staff, who was brave enough to tell the truth. The money is compensation for what I never got, not a reward. And honestly, if I could trade it all to have grown up knowing I belonged, I would. But I can't, so I'm using what I have to make sure other people don't feel the way I felt." Gretchen's eyes filled with tears. We lost him too, you know. He was distant with us, cold. We always felt like we were disappointing him. And that's when I understood the full tragedy of Harold's choices. He hadn't just failed me. He'd failed all of us. His guilt had poisoned everything. His silence had created a family where nobody felt fully seen or loved or enough. I know, I said softly, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry he couldn't be the father any of us needed. But that's on him, Gretchen, not on me, and not on you. We stood there for another moment, two daughters of the same complicated man, connected by DNA and damaged by secrets. And then Gretchen nodded once, grabbed a bag of spinach she clearly didn't need, and walked away. I let her go, because that's what healing looks like sometimes. Not dramatic confrontations or perfect apologies or moments where everyone suddenly understands each other. Just letting people walk away and knowing you don't need their acknowledgement to be whole. A year after the will reading, I hosted the first annual Elena and Harold Whitmore Scholarship Dinner. Full circle back in the estate. But this time the dining room was full of people who looked like me. People who'd grown up invisible, working-class kids. Children of domestic workers, immigrants, foster youth. People who'd been told in 1,000 small ways that they didn't quite belong, but had fought to get to college anyway. I gave out 10 full-ride scholarships that night, 10 kids who wouldn't have to choose between school and survival, 10 kids who'd know that someone saw them, valued them, believed they deserved everything they'd worked for. When I stood up to speak, looking out at faces that reflected every ethnicity and background, at kids who were the first in their families to go to college, I didn't tell them about the will or the money or the legal battle. Instead, I told them about the Thanksgiving when I was 14 and ate dinner on a bar stool in the kitchen. About the 30 years I spent believing I was lucky to have a room in a house where I actually belonged. About the moment I learned my entire identity had been built on a lie and how terrifying and liberating that had been. Here's what I want you to know, I said, my voice strong and clear in the room where I'd once served canapes to people who didn't see me. The people who make you feel small are wrong. They're always wrong. Not because you're secretly wealthy or secretly important or secretly somebody's hidden daughter, but because your humanity isn't conditional. You don't have to earn the right to take up space. You don't have to be grateful for basic dignity. You don't have to shrink yourself to make other people comfortable. I paused, looking at Maya standing in the back, at Maria sitting at the table she'd once have been expected to serve, at the portrait of my mother that now hung in the place of honor, where Catherine's portrait used to be. I spent 54 years apologizing for existing, I continued, learning to be invisible, making myself useful so I'd have value. And you know what? It didn't work. It never works. Because the people who want you to be small will always find new ways to diminish you, and the people who see your worth will see it whether you're making yourself small or taking up the whole room. One of the scholarship recipients, a girl named Jasmine, whose mother cleaned houses in Greenwich, raised her hand. But how do you stop? How do you stop making yourself small when it's all you've ever known? I smiled. Practice. You practice taking up space. You sit in chairs you used to think weren't for you. You speak up in rooms where you used to stay silent. You stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault. And some days you'll fail. Some days you'll catch yourself shrinking again, because 30 years or 17 years or however long you've been doing it, that doesn't disappear overnight. But you keep practicing, and eventually taking up space stops feeling like rebellion and starts feeling like breathing. The dinner ended with music and dancing and the kind of joy that comes from finally being seen. I watched these kids, my kids now in a way, fill the house with life. And I thought about Harold's last letter, the one about preparing to be enormous. He'd been right. All those years of being forced to be small, to survive, to observe, to learn, they'd been training, not for servitude, for this. For the moment when I'd have the power to make sure nobody else had to live the way I'd lived. 3 weeks later, I got a letter. Handwritten, expensive stationery, Greenwich postmark. Inside was a check for $25,000 made out to the Elena and Harold Whitmore Scholarship Fund, and a note in Gretchen's handwriting, for the kids, for what we all should have been. Gee, it wasn't redemption, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was something. An acknowledgement that we'd all been trapped by Harold's choices, and maybe we could all choose differently now. I framed the check instead of cashing it, sent her a new one to deposit, kept her gesture as a reminder that people can surprise you, that healing isn't linear, that sometimes the people who hurt you are also the people who were hurt. So here's where we end. I'm 55 now, sitting in my study, not Harold's, mine, looking out at gardens that are finally just gardens, not monuments to guilt or secrets or loss. I have money I'm using to change lives. I have a degree I earned myself. I have relationships built on equality instead of power dynamics. I have a home where I finally actually belong. And the question I asked at the beginning, what do you do when winning feels like losing, has an answer now. You stop measuring your life by wins and losses. You stop keeping score. You stop waiting for the people who hurt you to understand what they did, because they might never understand, and your healing can't depend on their enlightenment. You just live, fully, loudly, unapologetically. You become so completely yourself that the opinions of people who tried to diminish you become background noise you don't even hear anymore. That's the real inheritance, not the money, not the house. The knowledge that you were never actually small. You were just told you were, and you believed it until you didn't. Now here's what I want from you, because this isn't just my story. It's the story of everyone who's ever been made to feel less than, who's ever shrunk themselves, who's ever apologized for taking up space. I want you to tell me in the comments about a moment when you stopped making yourself small, when you took up space, when you claimed what was yours. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be as simple as sitting at the table instead of in the kitchen, speaking up in a meeting, saying no, setting a boundary. Because every time we practice being full-sized humans, we make it easier for the next person. Every time we refuse to shrink, we give permission to someone else to expand. That's how we change things, not through revenge, not through making other people feel as small as they made us feel, but through taking up the space we always deserved and inviting everyone else who's been invisible to do the same. So tell me, what's your moment? When did you stop apologizing for existing? And if you haven't had that moment yet, what would it look like? What's the first small step toward taking up the space you deserve? Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're not too much. They're not asking for too much. They don't need to earn basic dignity. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this. More moments of people discovering they were never actually small. They were just preparing to be enormous. I'm Iris Whitmore, not the housekeeper's daughter, not the charity case, not the help, just Iris. Finally, fully, unapologetically, just Iris. And that's enough. That's always been enough. It just took me 54 years to believe it. Your turn. Tell me your story. I'm listening. And this time, I'm not serving. I'm sitting at the table, right where I've always belonged. Thank you for listening to my story.